It's very important for us to understand the difference between unhealthy grieving and healthy grieving. And healthy grieving is mourning the loss, openly talking about it, and it's important that we get it out somehow. But when we go into unhealthy grief, that is where we become stuck.
Unfortunately, part of life is dealing with loss. Sooner or later, someone we love will pass away, or a tragic experience could cause us to lose our homes or our health. So how do we best deal with these losses and grieve in a healthy way? I'm Eric Scatabo, and on today's Focus on the Family Australia, family counselor Deb Sorensen chats with Glenise Dedrick from Chaplain Australia. Glenise specializes in dealing with issues of grief and loss, and she has some practical advice on how we can grieve in a healthy way while transitioning into a new normal. That's Glenise Dedrick on today's Focus on the Family Australia.
Welcome to the studio, Glenise.
Thank you, Deb.
You're very experienced in talking with people and working with people around grief as a chaplain and as a trainer of chaplains.
Yes.
And you've actually written a program called The Seasons of Grief. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, Seasons of Grief, what I've written is taken from Ecclesiastes 3, where it talks about there's a time for loss, there's a time to live, there's a time to die, there's a time for seasons in our lives.
And I think Peter, Paul and Mary did a song, didn't they, with those words?
I think they did.
Yeah,
yes, We're going back a long way now.
I've shown my age. Yes. So the time to grieve, a time to live, a time to die.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's a very difficult time. And looking at seasons, we can have, like in Melbourne, 4 seasons in one day. Mm-hmm. And it's the same in grieving, that we can in one day experience so many different emotions, so many different things in just one day. And often people that are going through those emotions, if they're not understanding their own feelings and why they're going through those things, often they can feel as though they're going crazy. Mm. And so I have developed this program to bring awareness. I have a pet little saying, awareness is 90% of the solution. And often when we grieve, we actually don't have a great deal of awareness of what that often looks like, unless we have seen a book or read a book
or done some study in that area.
Yeah, that's right.
Let's talk about loss, because often when we use the word grief, we immediately think of the loss of a loved one.
Yes, we do.
And certainly we do grieve or mourn the loss of a loved one. But there are other losses that we also mourn, aren't there?
Absolutely, there are. Loss of jobs. That at the moment we're experiencing a lot of that in the manufacturing trade in our country, where men and women are losing jobs and probably been in that particular job for 25, 30, 40 years.
Yeah, and there are a lot of losses associated with that. The loss of income,
yes.
The loss of security,
yes.
The loss of mateship and companionship.
Yep, community.
Yeah, the loss of community at work, the loss of perhaps even their home.
Absolutely.
And other investments.
Absolutely. They have sometimes high mortgages and find themselves unable to pay. And so, those losses become accumulative.
Yeah, and other losses that are quite common that I see often too, the loss of marriages and family breakdown, and the loss of, again, security there and love there and loss of dreams associated.
All of those things.
Yeah, with
and it's really difficult. Also, we are finding too a lot of losses where people have accidents and maybe a loss of a limb or a loss of their mobility and all of those
loss
areas.
Of health is a big one.
Loss of health.
Yeah.
When we get older too,
yes.
Loss of memory. I'm experiencing a little of that myself. However, when we do get older, there are family members that are experiencing their parents becoming Alzheimer's disease or having Alzheimer's disease or dementia, and that can be a huge heavily weighing on the heart of those family members. It's really difficult for them to adjust.
Yeah, that's right. Even though your parent might be still living, there's the loss of that relationship that you've had with that person, and that's called the long goodbye. Yeah. And then there's also things like tragedies. We've had several big fires across this country in recent years, and people losing their homes, being displaced from community.
That's right. And so I had the privilege of working in the bushfires for 2 years. In the recovery stage, and people are still suffering in those areas, even though it was back in 2009. We feel as though, well, you know what, it's quite a while ago now, but there are people that are in those areas that are still struggling. Yeah. And again, like you said, often they become displaced and they have had to move out of the area that they loved so dearly.
Yeah. And more recent fires in New South Wales. And recurring fires across the country, and floods. So let's talk about some of the experiences of grief as far as, what does it look like?
It's interesting because a lot of people would say, so how long do I grieve? And my answer to that is, well, how long is a piece of string? Our grieving is how long it takes as long as it takes. And I think it's important for us to be able to normalise the emotions that we actually go through. And that's really important. I remember a lady who, in the bushfires, and I happened to run into her and her husband who had lost everything. And it was a really sad story, and which, along with many other sad stories, but she introduced herself and told me her story, and she said to me, Glenise, I cannot understand why I'm so angry. I have never been this angry in my whole life, and I just don't understand. I've turned into this person who is angry at everybody and everything, and I feel like I want to lash out. And I said to her, you need to be kind to yourself, and that's normal to feel angry. And validating her feelings and validating those emotions. And the moment she heard that from me, she fell into my arms and wept and wept and wept and wept. And so, again, talking about validating those feelings is so important in this journey, because often we don't understand why we are feeling the way we're feeling. And it's really important to invite someone to journey with you or journey with us so that we can have that person that we can trust. And we may talk about the same thing over and over and over and over again, but if you have someone who is caring, loving, and just wants to be a presence in your life, that is the right person to talk to.
Yeah. And I think it is really important for us to understand that there's a whole range of emotions that people can experience.
There are.
And
huge range.
Yeah, and the key is to actually be honest about that. And look, we're in a society that doesn't like pain. We're bombarded with messages that if you're feeling any pain at all, take a pill. Like fix it. You've got to be happy at all costs even. Whereas we need, in order to be healthy, to be honest about the feelings. So maybe the first step is even
just acknowledging how you're feeling.
Yeah, and accepting that in each other. And two people can experience the same loss.
Yes.
Both losing the same job or both losing their house and be feeling different feelings.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So was her husband angry, or was he expressing it in a different way?
Well, unfortunately, her husband was trying to be strong because within a matter of weeks of them losing everything, he was also diagnosed with cancer.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And so they were going through all these complexities of losses that they had experienced and still experiencing. Yeah. Fortunately, he has come through and he is well again. And coming into that new normal. We've talked a lot about coming into a new normal, and many times...
Let's talk about coming into a new normal.
Yeah,
what does that mean, Glenise?
Well, I think it's really important for us to understand that when we are dealing with loss, whether it be loss of a home, loss of a loved one, material things, a loss of a limb, loss of our health, it's really important for us to understand that we can't have the way it was back again. It really it's gone. And we need to acknowledge that. It's important for us to acknowledge that it's not going to be the same. And often people will use the language of, I just want my normal life back. But it's not going to be normal. And so we need to transition into that new normal. And it's when we talk about a new normal, it's a new normal, a new way of doing things. It might be beginning new traditions. You may have had a shack that you always went to for Christmas, for example, or holidays, or that was where the family gathered, but now that shack is gone. And so to create a new normal, maybe find something else that you can begin something in, setting up a new place, a new way of doing that. So that's coming into a new normal, recognising the old has gone, the new has come, and the transition may be difficult, but we can come into a place of living in a new normal.
That's Glenise Dedrick from Chaplain Australia speaking with family counselor Deb Sorensen. We'll have more of this conversation on grief and loss when we return right here on Focus on the Family, Australia.
You're listening to Focus on the Family Australia, and we'd love to hear from you. Why not send us an email at response@families.org.au. That's response@families.org.au. Please let us know if there's a topic or question you'd like us to discuss on a future program. Once again, that's response@families.org.au.
And welcome back to Focus on the Family Australia, where today our guest is Glenise Dedrick from Chaplain Australia. She specializes in helping people deal with issues of grief and loss. Glenise is in conversation with family counselor Deb Sorensen.
Let's take a step back again. We've talked about feeling anger, feeling sad. What are the other feelings that we might experience?
Well, I love H. Norman Wright's little book on experiencing grief. It's a great little book to have. And I use this book in giving it to people that are struggling in their grief. And he talks about grief being a tangled ball of emotions. And so when we look at a ball of wool that's in a mess, it's like that tangled ball of emotions, and I love that. And so the different emotions that he may feel is anxiety. He talks about anxiety, rage, betrayal. Often betrayal is part of loss. You might feel as though you've been betrayed. Pain, jealousy. These are really unusual emotions. When we think about it, I don't know if your listeners are hearing some of this, but they might be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm feeling that way. Confusion. You know, when we're going through grief, there can be a whole lot of confusion going on.
And trying to make sense of it all, and why has it happened?
That's right.
Yeah, what's going to happen next? And
yes, and it's very difficult. And being in that state of mind can be very difficult. And this is where having someone to talk to can be just so relieving. You can just talk to somebody about those emotions.
Yeah, and getting it out into the open, actually naming some of the stuff actually helps you kind of work out what you are actually feeling.
That's right.
But some people don't like to talk. Some people like to just process things on their own. Are there other ways to then, express those feelings?
Absolutely. I'm a great advocate for journaling or just writing things down. It's just really important to be able to get it out. If we bottle it up and we push it down and we ignore it, we can then actually come into a place of complexity and experiencing complex grief. So it's very important for us to understand the difference between unhealthy grieving and healthy grieving. And healthy grieving is mourning the loss, openly talking about it. But you spoke about if somebody is processing it without being able to talk about it, I find that might go and move into that complexity or complex grief. And it's important that we get it out somehow, even writing it down, journaling it, being able to just go for a long walk and talking to God, praying, spending time with the one who created us. Mm-hmm. And that way you're being heard. Mm. You know, God says in his word that he inclines his ear to hear the prayers of his children. Yeah. And so when we are talking to God, he's inclining his ear and he's listening. And so we're not walking this journey alone. We don't have to walk this journey alone.
Yeah. And so what I've heard you saying is here that part of the grieving in a healthy way is being honest.
Yes, being open and being able to get it out. It's not healthy to lock things up inside of us. Mm-hmm. When we go into complex grief or unhealthy grief, that is where we become stuck. And being stuck in our grief, being unable to move forward, that's when we have to recognise we do need help.
Okay, so how's that different to perhaps, you know, someone hearing a song, you know, a couple of years later and it triggers emotions or, you know, anniversaries and other kind of triggers of memories when we feel sad or angry again that takes us back to the time that we lost our house in the bushfire. And I'm thinking of people that lost their homes in the Victorian fires, you know, their grief being re-triggered by fires in New South Wales.
Yes.
Is that unhealthy or is that a normal just response?
I believe those are normal responses.
Okay.
Memories will always be there. Yeah. I went through Cyclone Tracy. If you remember when Cyclone Tracy
74,
happened.
I think.
That's right. And we lost everything that night, and it was a frightening night. And here I am 38 years later, and I still struggle with high winds. I still struggle with lightning and all of those things, and they trigger those experiences that I had in Cyclone Tracy.
Yeah.
So those memories will always be there, and little things often trigger that. The different memories.
Yeah.
But that's a healthy thing.
That's right. So that's healthy, that's okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Yes, so that's not what you're talking about when you're talking about unhealthy, complex grief.
Well, unhealthy or complex grief can be seen in so many different ways. For example, complex grief can become chronic. And chronic means excessive and continues for a long time. And in other words, what I said before, we become stuck in that chronic grief.
And unable to move into a new normal, perhaps?
That's right. That's right. And prolonged grief. Prolonged grief is a part of that complex grief. For example, there was a young lass that I knew who lost her dad in her early 20s, and she never went to the funeral. And years later, in having a discussion with her, she was explaining to me that she still cried every night over the loss of her dad.
Wow.
And that was years later. And when I'm saying years, that was something like 15 years later. Now, I think you would agree with me that that's fairly complex and that's chronic. And so we talked about her dad, and she said, please don't talk about him. She couldn't even talk about him. So in just allowing her to cry again and ask some open-ended questions, she finally admitted that she hadn't been to the graves. She didn't even know where he was. She didn't even know where he was buried because she didn't go to the funeral. And so after discussing that, we went and visited the funeral site of her dad, and she sat there for about an hour on her own, just chatting with her dad. And she said goodbye. And that was an amazing turning point for her. And I've spoken to her since, and she now is living that new normal and not just longing for his presence so desperately that she was stuck. Now she has beautiful memories. She can talk about her dad. She can laugh about the things that he was funny at, whereas before she couldn't do that.
Yeah, that's a great example. And I think you mentioned before about awareness being 90% of the solution. Right. I think when we understand that grief is really quite isolating, and selfish isn't the right word, but it's self-focusing when we're feeling the pain associated with any kind of loss. And so that in itself can create extra problems with relationships in marriage, if you're grieving in different ways, both sort of shutting off from each other emotionally because you're just not you're just not in a place where you can actually offer that comfort that the other needs because you're hungry for it yourself.
I know.
And the same with your children. Now, if you're aware of that, then you can start to let other people step in and help.
Yes. Unfortunately, some people feel as though they can't burden another person.
Yeah.
But when you're dealing with incredible loss, regardless of what that loss is, people want to help.
Yeah.
I really believe people want to help. It's just that they don't know how to help. And often just by saying, a meal would be really wonderful, or it'd be just lovely if we could just go and have a coffee, or just the small things, the little things become very, very helpful. So it's about inviting loved ones, it's about inviting family, friends into your world to help you go through that journey.
Yeah. So recapping, it's about being honest with what you're experiencing.
Yes.
Finding ways to express that.
Absolutely.
And acknowledging that we're all different. We bring our own histories and personalities to that. And then being open to accepting help.
Yes.
That's really important. And stepping into the new normal, giving yourself time, being patient, being gentle on yourself and others. Now, if folks are struggling, you would encourage them to seek professional help. I've heard you say there, get some counsellors if you've got any concerns for yourself or your children or other loved ones. Find some counsellors or chaplains who have done some study in grief because they can really help.
I think that's really important, Deb.
Yeah.
Often when we just use our family members to talk about things, that's wonderful, but often we're emotionally connected. I think it's important to have somebody that's outside of the family that's actually not emotionally connected, that can actually have a view from a distance and be able to really sit with you and just explain some of the complexities that you might be going through. Or you might just feel more comfortable in speaking to somebody who's not a family member.
Yeah. And as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus, Scripture and prayer play such an important role in our healing process, doesn't it?
I don't think that I could have ever gotten through all the things that I've been through in just the trials that you go through in life, just the losses that you go through in life. And I've had many. If I hadn't have had Christ in my life, I don't believe I would have survived as well as I've survived. I really don't. And God says in His Word that I will never leave you nor forsake you. The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit. Often when we are going through that loss, that grief, that trauma, God is with us and we feel that being crushed in our spirit. It's very important for us, I think, to know that our Creator is near us.
And I think a faith in Jesus is certainly an anchor to get us through the storms and losses in life. Thank you so much, Glenise, for sharing some of your wisdom with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And if people would like to find out more about the Seasons of Grief seminar or workshop, please contact Focus on the Family at families.org.au. Thanks for joining us for today's Focus on the Family Australia. I really hope it's been encouraging for you and your family. For more family advice or to listen again online, our website is families.org.au. That's families.org.au. If you'd like a copy of today's program, you can give us a call at 1300 300 361. 1300 300 361. On behalf of the entire team here at Focus, I'm Deb Sorensen, wishing you God's blessing on your family and inviting you to join us again next time for another edition of Focus on the Family, Australia.